The Denver Broncos tight end room in 2023 wasn't good enough. Could NFL free agency be the one area that make the biggest splash? We'll break it down and much more on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's happening, Broncos Country? Welcome into a brand new episode of Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much to everybody in Broncos Country for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. Just a reminder, you can get this podcast for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. So do us a favor, if you haven't done so already, hit that subscribe button down below so you never miss out on a day's worth of Broncos news, content, coverage, analysis, and more. I'm Cody Roark, Broncos reporter from Mile High Sports, joined alongside, as always, by Sayre Bedinger, site expert, PutOnTheOrange.com. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Sayre, tight end is one of the more important positions that we'll talk about, regardless on the offensive side of the ball of quarterback. Quarterback is obviously the top dog there, but Denver needs more of the tight end position. And we even got a little bit of rumblings from our good friend Mike Kliss of 9 News that George Payton himself recognizes that Denver can't really return into 2023 with the same tight end group, which asks us, hey, like, where does Denver go here? I mean, where should Sean Payton look first?
Right. And I think that free agency is one of those areas that you could definitely do that. I mean, and a prominent name that's out there who's connected to Sean Payton, because, of course, in free agency, Cody, we always look first and foremost for coaching connections, because who you know in the NFL really matters. And hey, who knows Sean Payton better than Jimmy Graham? They had some really great days there in New Orleans together. And obviously, I think with Jimmy still playing at a relatively high level in terms of his red zone abilities, he has at least 3 touchdowns in each of the last 4 seasons. May not be playing a ton of snaps, Cody, but I think it's a name to look out for, at least in terms of maybe being a secondary or tertiary option at the position. But free agency, like you mentioned in the open, this could be the tight end position, the one area the Broncos do make that big splash, because when you talk about value per dollar in free agency, running back, tight end, these guys are giving you touches and red zone productivity, and they play every snap that you're not necessarily getting value per dollar at wide receiver. So you may pay a wide receiver $11 million a year. He could be your 3rd or 4th option in the offense. But if you're paying a tight end or a running back $11 million a year, that's probably one of the better players in the league at that position. So that's kind of what I mean by this is that position group where you could get the best bang for your buck. It's not the best free agent tight end class, but I think there are some players that could really help the Denver Broncos.
Well, our good friend Ross Jackson over there at the Locked On Saints podcast at times followed him throughout the season, following what Jimmy Graham was doing. And he had a lot of high praise for Jimmy Graham, to the point that, hey, even though that he didn't have as many opportunities, consistently on the field a lot, when he was on the field, when he was targeted, he made the most of those opportunities, which gave him the nickname Himmy Graham, even at this point of his career. Like, I remember when Jimmy was such a dominant tight end. I mean, you go back to the Seattle Seahawks, you go back to his time with the New Orleans Saints. There's something there with his big body frame. And look, you wouldn't be bringing in a guy like Jimmy Graham to be your number 1 tight end option, right? He's an insurance policy. He's a guy that, in my opinion, I think if you had to make a comparison, Sarah, who did Sean bring in last year? Chris Manhertz. You bring in Jimmy Graham or Chris Manhertz, like, who are you going with? I'm going with Jimmy in this situation. Chris is going to be, if I'm not mistaken, I think he's going to be a free agent, if I'm not mistaken. Didn't he sign
got 1 year left?
Okay, so it was like a 2-year minimal deal. Troutman is obviously the free agent. Chris Manhertz, great dude, unbelievably kind, great leader, very just puts his head down and works. As Sean says, you know what you're getting with him. But when it comes to what Denver needs at the tight end position, I just don't feel like he did enough to warrant being back here in 2024. You need an upgrade there. Now, look, I think the acknowledgement here, Greg Dulcich, his injury, George Payton acknowledged that. Greg's been injured. They're really hoping that Greg could turn around, but it sounds like they're not fully holding on to okay, hey, Greg's going to be fully healthy in 2024. They are looking at other options, and Lucas Krull is obviously another guy that's going to be in the mix. I think you have to add a guy to this room. And I think adding a guy like Jimmy Graham, in my opinion, Sayre, I think would be a nice boost to Denver's offense if Greg is healthy, if you have a Lucas Krull, and now you throw in a guy like Jimmy Graham. I think that's a solid 3 receiving tight end set that you could have here going forward.
And if nothing else, you bring Jimmy Graham in for the offseason, for OTAs, for training camp. You get him in that mix and you put him in a room with Greg Dulcich and Lucas Krull, 2 young guys that you really believe in their pass catching abilities. And you let them just soak up everything they possibly can from a player like Jimmy Graham. There's upside to moves like this, Cody, that I think a lot of times when we try to spitball ideas, a lot of people kind of want to just stomp the idea out right away and say, nope, no Jimmy Graham. He's too old. He's too this, that, and the other. I mean, what if he could help make other young players better, right? That's something to ponder, at least in this instance in particular, because the Broncos do have 2 young guys in Dulcich and Krull who could be playmakers at the position. And yes, you want to raise the floor at tight end. Does Jimmy Graham help you do that at 170 snaps a season? Maybe not, but also he may raise the floor for your red zone offense. He may raise the floor for your third down offense, whereas a guy like Adam Troutman, Chris Manhertz, we didn't see that last year. Even Nate Adkins, Cody, who the Broncos kept as an undrafted player on their roster. I think they do kind of need a bit of a reset at the tight end position. And what does that mean? I think ultimately you need guys that do contribute more in the passing game, because it was kind of controversial to just get rid of Albert Okwuegbunam after what he showed in the preseason last year. And the Philadelphia Eagles, even after a down year, they've already re-signed him. They picked him back up. So, hey, no Albert O reunion in Denver this year. Not that we were expecting it anyway, but that it just goes to show you need guys in your program that can be a difference maker in the passing game, because like George Payton said, they felt like they were really missing that last season.
And the dynamic was so frustrating to watch, because I also felt like when Chris Manhertz and Adam Troutman were on the field at the same time, I think everybody knew that, okay, hey, the Broncos, they're running here at this point. This is a clear giveaway when they're in 12 personnel. Then when they come in 3 personnel, they'd have a lot of heavy looks. And it's like, hey, Denver's not going to pass out of this. They're going to run the ball. So teams would sell out there. Got to diversify your looks, I think, offensively. And I think that's maybe something that Sean Payton will go back to the drawing board on. Now, while Jimmy Graham could be an intriguing, interesting add here to the Broncos offense in free agency, it wouldn't cost you a lot of money to do so, and you get some of the benefits like the veteran leadership there. Could Denver maybe make a bigger splash with maybe a former AFC West rival like Hunter Henry? We'll take a look at that here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. A lot of us spend our lives wishing that we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and to make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters to you so you can do more of it. Whether it's trying to find balance in your career versus your life, that's something that I struggled with in the last year, and I utilized BetterHelp really at the start of when I jumped in as a beat reporter here for Mile High Sports. I had a lot of stress and I had a lot of anxiety, and it was very overwhelming. I connected with a therapist on BetterHelp, and she helped me come up with tools and things that would help me feel like I didn't have imposter syndrome at time. It was beneficial to me. I connected with my therapist by filling out a brief survey, and I vibed well. If you don't vibe well with the therapist you get matched to, you can change therapists at any time at no additional cost to yourself. So if you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and best of all, suited to your schedule and your timeline wherever you're at. I always think it's important to meet people where they're at. BetterHelp makes it easy for you to do just that. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/locked on to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/locked on.
The top tier tight ends in 2024 NFL free agency may not be the biggest names at the position in the league, but they certainly could help the Denver Broncos and fit the Broncos budget in 2024 free agency, which is a big deal. Cody and I are going to break down some of the biggest names available, a couple names that you may recognize that could elevate this Denver Broncos offense in 2024 on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. I want to say thank you to every single one of you that makes Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, free and available everywhere that you listen to podcasts, as well as on YouTube, where you can watch the show and engage with other members of Broncos Country. Cody, the tight end position, I want to hear from everybody listening as well, your thoughts on this. I think we've got some interesting comments regarding offensive skill positions in general. People not necessarily wanting the Broncos to focus on skill players until the quarterback position is figured out. I don't think that's really a cart before the horse kind of thing. I think you have to put forth the best possible roster for whoever's going to be your quarterback. So I do think the tight end position, even if quarterback remains unsettled in free agency, I think this is an area we could see the Broncos spend a little bit of money, Cody. And there's a couple guys available. Let's start with Hunter Henry, the New England Patriots. We didn't see him when the Patriots came to Denver late last season. He was hurt. And I think that the common misconception with Hunter Henry is that he hasn't been available. That was a conversation I had on Twitter the other day. He played 14 games last year, 17 the year before that, 17 the year before that. He's stringing together some good seasons here. What are your thoughts on Hunter Henry, and do you think he could be that guy that the Broncos are missing offensively?
You know, the thing with Hunter Henry, and I like that you bring him up. Now, I feel like his time with the Los Angeles Chargers, maybe he didn't have like the career start he wanted there from a production standpoint, but I feel like in the right system. And look, the New England Patriots offense was terrible last year, but he was a bright spot for them. I remember specifically watching that game against the Kansas City Chiefs. And, you know, this is, I think, when Denver was 1 or 2 games back from being in, you know, an important juncture there from the Chiefs. And you're like, all right, hey, the Patriots, they could play upset special. Like, it was a competitive game. Hunter Henry made some terrific catches in that game. And, you know, for him, I think the production value there, despite their inconsistencies offensively, he shined in a system that didn't look so bright at times. And I think that's where maybe he could add a wrinkle into the Broncos offense. And once again, I mean, you could be making the argument here, Sayre, with any of these guys we're going to talk about here in this segment in particular. Could these guys come in and be tight end one here, especially considering where things are with Greg Dulcich? I want to go back to something on Greg here that kind of ties things into my analysis here. In training camp, right? Like, we heard so much from Sean Payton about Greg and him becoming the Joker. But once training camp actually happened and you were deeper into practices, Greg didn't have a lot of great practices for the Broncos. And, you know, he wasn't even the guy. Like, Adam Troutman was starting ahead of him, was getting all the looks in the first team. Greg Dulcich was working a lot with the second team and sometimes sprinkling in with the first team. And so for me, I was like, is that just Sean Payton trusting a guy that he knows, or is that just not where Greg is at right now at this part of his career? And obviously the injuries have hurt him. Is this a move, right, with a guy like Hunter Henry? Does he become tight end one here in that room, Sayre?
I think he really would. I mean, I think instantly. I don't mean any disrespect towards Greg Dulcich or anything, and we certainly don't want to write off the final 2 years of his rookie contract and just say, well, you know, screw Greg Dulcich. Like, he's not going to be able to do anything. I think we liked what we saw from him in his rookie year, but you're right. I mean, there's been all these expectations heaped upon him based on, you know, his awesome hair and things like that, and people really wanting to fall in love with him. He wears the number 80, which is legendary in Broncos country history. I think that there's been just too much expected of Dulcich in his first 2 years, and it's almost like a Julius Thomas kind of situation with him, isn't it? Remember when the Broncos picked Julius Thomas back in 2011 in the 4th round? Everybody's like, who the heck is Julius Thomas? Basketball player from Portland State. Barely ever played football. Like, who the heck is this guy? Then he comes to the NFL and he's unavailable for his first 2 years. So now you're thinking, going into 2013 season, right? You're thinking, well, Julius Thomas, he hasn't done anything. He's barely played football. He doesn't know what he's doing out there. He can't stay healthy. Then he explodes for 24 touchdowns over a 2-year period. So I'm not saying give up on Greg Dulcich. What I am saying, though, is I agree with the Hunter Henry. He would be tight end one in Denver. He would be signing in at a number, probably $8 million or so per season, to where you would expect him to be tight end one. Same situation, I think, Cody, for a player like Dalton Schultz, who I was very skeptical of Dalton Schultz when he was with the Cowboys. I'm kind of thinking, well, Dak Prescott really seems to like this guy, and he kind of force feeds him the ball. He's unspectacular in terms of his athleticism. He doesn't have a ton of like giddy up after the catch. Man, if Dalton Schultz hasn't been one of the most consistent tight ends in the NFL over the last 4 or 5 years, he put forth a really, really good season with the Houston Texans last year. 59 catches, 635 yards, 5 touchdowns. May not be the most spectacular guy, but I think he kind of fits that same category as Hunter Henry of this guy would undoubtedly be your tight end one if you go out and sign him in free agency.
Well, and I think maybe an option that you can have here too with any of these guys. Let's say you were to add Dalton Schultz, right, alongside Greg, alongside Lucas. I mean, you have flexibility to do a lot of really cool double tight situations. When you go 13 personnel, you can have a guy in the slot. You can have two guys in line if you want to, or you can just go empty out of 13 if you wanted to. But you have size, you have speed. And I think the thing with Schultz is he was always this guy who could just find a zone, sit there, catch it, and then get a first down. Like you mentioned, he's not going to blow you away athletically, but I liked what I saw. And I thought initially last year in the free agency period, I think everybody was keeping an eye on him like, okay, is he going to get a big time money deal? Heck, it just goes like the wave was just going like, oh, Dalton Schultz still hasn't signed. He hasn't signed yet. And then he just, he takes a massive discount in comparison to what we thought he would get on the estimated market value. Those change. And I think that tight end changes. I would like Dalton Schultz maybe being a reliable target added into the mix. Now, I think in terms of the conversation we just had about Hunter Henry, I think if you add Schultz, I don't know necessarily if he becomes tight end one, but he becomes, I think, a better version of maybe what you had expected, right? I mean, in Denver rolled with Nate Adkins last year, as you had talked about. That would essentially replace, I think, Nate Adkins' production here on the roster. Like, I love his story. Nate is such a great dude. I've loved talking with Nate. When we talk about, okay, like, can you produce for this offense? We didn't really see it last year. We saw a little bit in the preseason, saw flashes, but in the regular season, it was kind of up and down, which is to be expected for an undrafted rookie. So, maybe bring in a guy like Schultz and, hey, like, you're going to have competition. And that's where, like, I think Chris Manhertz and Nate Adkins would probably compete for a roster spot against each other, against a guy like Greg Dulcich, Lucas Krull, and then if Schultz or Henry were added to the mix, those would be three guaranteed locks, in my opinion. And that last spot would be up in the air between those two. I mean, that's kind of how I would see it playing out.
And I think ultimately what you and I are both getting at here is whether the Broncos go after tier one free agent, whether they go after a veteran like Jimmy Graham, who may be lower on the totem pole in terms of overall value. I think what we're saying ultimately is this team needs to raise the floor in the pass catching department. I mean, there's no question about it. They need not just a contingency plan for Greg Dulcich, but maybe an alternative plan A. I mean, and that's very different. There's the break in case of emergency, which could be Lucas Krull next year. And then there's this guy is our number one guy, or this guy could be 1A to Dulcich 1B type of thing. So it's ultimately all about raising the floor in the pass catching department, because when you collect guys like, Chris Manhertz, Adam Troutman, Nate Adkins, we saw over the course of last season the toll that took on this offense, not having that reliable guy on third down, not having somebody who could go break a tackle, not having somebody who could win contested catch situations in the red zone, not having somebody who could do X, Y, or Z in the passing game. And frankly, Cody, I don't think we saw enough from a guy like Manhertz in the running game. And I may be wrong about that. I'm not saying I sat and studied every single run blocking rep that Chris Manhertz had, but judging by the way the Broncos ran the ball last season, and like you said, when he's on the field, you're almost telegraphing that you're running the ball. It's bordering on a liability to have that. And so although these guys are tremendous players throughout the course of their career, it's time for the Broncos to raise the floor in the pass catching department.
Well, it was an issue when you have three running backs who have more overall targets and catches in the passing game than most of your tight ends overall. And that, I think, was a very, very sad statistic for the Broncos. But hats off to Adam Troutman. I mean, that dude battled his tail off all last year, despite really not having much around him. Like, I think the things that he was asked to do, it was almost kind of like, what are the Broncos doing offensively? Which we've said that so many times here on the show. I know Broncos fans have felt the same exact way. Well, we took a look right there at a couple of options. It could be potential, starters, tight end number ones here for this team. What about some sleeper players, including the potential return of a former Bronco, Noah Fant? He's set to become a free agent. Could the Broncos bring him back? Because they never wanted to let him go in the first place. We'll break it all down here on today's brand new episode, Locked On Broncos. Today's Locked On Broncos is brought to you by our friends over there at FanDuel Sportsbook, and FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook. The NBA season is in full swing for the second half stretch as teams are competing to make a push for the postseason. Seeding is always important, tiebreakers, everything like that. So the stakes are much higher, and that's where FanDuel Sportsbook can come into the mix for you for this NBA season. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, because right now, new customers, they get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all of your favorite NBA players like Nikola Jokic, or your favorite teams like the Denver Nuggets. I know Sayre is a Chicago Bulls fan. I know it's hard to bet on the Bulls this time of the year, but you know what? The NBA season is fun, and FanDuel makes it even more engaging to watch your team every single day. Bet on all your favorite NBA players, once again, with quick bets, live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and more. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot. FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Could the Denver Broncos reunite with Noah Fant as one of those sleeper free agent acquisitions? The Broncos, they didn't want to get rid of him in the first place, but he could be finding his way back after a couple of years with the Seattle Seahawks. Everything's coming around full circle for the Denver Broncos, but one thing that is always a full circle here is that we always have you covered every single day all year long on the Locked On Broncos podcast, available on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts for free. Thank you once again to all the everydayers out there in Broncos country for making us your first listen of the day every single day. When you want Broncos conversation, looking at every side of the coin without the hot takes, without all the crazy scenarios and shenanigans, this is the place for real Broncos conversation. We appreciate you so much. Sayre, let's open things up here. We really kind of talked about Noah Fant. I think initially, going back to when he was drafted by the Broncos, I think a lot of fans were like, what? Why would the Broncos, they're trading back, they're taking a tight end. And then you saw some of the flashes with Noah Fant with the yards after the catch. Unfortunately, his time in Denver was, I think, misutilization once again with Pat Shurmur. We saw end arounds, we saw him in motion, and we did just never fully kind of became what it was. And I felt like in Seattle, I felt like he was very underrated. I know a lot of Seahawks fans, I saw it on Twitter, they were saying, hey, like Noah Fant was actually a very under the radar guy for us this past season. So there's a chance he could come back to Denver. As we mentioned, Broncos didn't want to let him go in the first place.
Right, which I think they were right in wanting that, because remember back in 2019, I mean, Noah Fant as a rookie under Rich Scangarello, and I know we don't necessarily fondly remember the Rich Scangarello era, but at that season, Noah Fant led all tight ends in yards after the catch per reception, and that was a big knock on him coming out of Iowa, was like, this guy doesn't create in space, but the Broncos found ways to get his athleticism on the move over the middle of the field, as we saw George Payton allude to what the Broncos really need from their tight end position. And Noah Fant is somebody that I think can really help create for your offense. And is he necessarily a 120 target guy at the position? I'm not sure about that, Cody. I don't know if he's really at that point. And like you said, he was underrated in Seattle. They had a lot of guys there. Will Dissly, Colby Parkinson. And when you have that many tight ends and you have that many mouths to feed, along with DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, and then Jackson Smith and Jigba this past season, I mean, it's great to see that he was still productive. And I know for sure that he wasn't happy about the trade when it went down. Of course, it's been 2 years now, so who knows how happy he is in hindsight. But I think, he's from my area, Cody. He's from the Omaha area. Maybe he wants to come back. Denver is just a quick flight away from here, closer to family, things like that. So maybe he would want to come back. I mean, is anybody keeping number 87 warm right now? I think he could even get his old number back. So, I mean, I think he's a good option. He's athletic, he creates after the catch. He may not be everybody's cup of tea when it comes to winning contested catches. I get that, but I think Noah Fant could really elevate the passing game for sure.
I think Travis Kelce has ruined how we view the tight end position, because everyone's trying to find the next Travis Kelce. And the reality is Travis Kelce is one of one. Like, his evolution as a player is incredible. Now, look, he plays for the Chiefs. I get it. Broncos fans probably hate him for that. I like Travis. I think from a player standpoint, watching him grow has been fun to watch. It's been unfortunate at the expense of the Denver Broncos, though I will say Denver this year did a pretty good job holding him in check, especially in the game where the Broncos snapped the Chiefs' winning streak against them here. Maybe another guy could be in the mix here too. Gerald Everett used to play inside the AFC West as well for the Los Angeles Chargers. Is a guy that I've always felt like could be an under the radar. He has some athleticism to him where maybe you can get him the ball in space. You can get him the ball in the flat and he can do some damage with it. He's an option there. One thing too, missed tackles. And look, I think that's one thing that we talked about. You have to have guys that can break tackles or run through contact and not go down when the first guy wraps up there. Gerald Everett is a guy that could offer that value here to the Broncos passing attack at the tight end position, which, look, last year, like, I'll go back to it. Remember week 1 against the Raiders? There was one play before Greg got hurt where he caught a pass in the middle of the field, and it was like third and 14, and he ended up showing that burst. And it's like, okay, wow, like there's Greg Dulcich. Yes, you see that. Late in that second half, after Dulcich was out, I think it was a 3rd and 18, the Broncos found Adam Troutman. He catches it across the middle, I think maybe like 10 or 11 yards. And you're like, okay, hey, he's got 6, 7 more yards to go. And you could just tell the lack of speed difference, right? And the lack of just athleticism. Gerald Everett is a guy that maybe brings more of that athleticism back to the table in a situation like that.
Definitely. And he has connection to the coaching staff. Obviously, Joe Lombardi, having spent time in Los Angeles with the Chargers, he's familiar with Gerald Everett and his skill set and him as a person, what he brings to the offense specifically. So that's going to be super helpful and will be super telling as well. If the Broncos decide not to bring him in or not to even make him an offer or call his agent, that would speak volumes either way. So you look at that connection as a potential, hey, here's something. And then you also kind of look at it and say, well, if they don't give him a call, Joe Lombardi worked with him directly. So that would speak volumes. I think another name that just became available, Cody, is Jonnu Smith, somebody who has history with Arthur Smith dating back to his time at Tennessee. They trade for him in Atlanta. I don't know that he's necessarily going to follow Arthur Smith to the Pittsburgh Steelers. I mean, he would be basically saying, I'm going to be the backup tight end there. I don't know that he's necessarily interested in doing that, but I think Jonnu Smith is somebody that when you talk about raising the floor in the pass catching department, he's an intriguing option. And because he was cut, he's not going to factor in the compensatory draft pick formula going forward, which we'll see when free agency comes around. Like, how important is that to the Broncos? And are they trying to collect compensatory picks? Are they going to be actively working towards that? I don't know, but a guy who's a cap casualty at least could help you in that regard if you do want to explore that avenue.
Another name to watch that I know you're very fond of. We're going to see a brand new era for the New England Patriots. Is Mike Gesicki going to be back for them this season? More than likely. I mean, they could entertain bringing him back in free agency, but he's also another option. And he made a really terrific contested catch against the Broncos on Christmas Eve on a very, very cold night in which we all sat there miserable saying like, wow, what is going on with the Broncos here? A debacle, the nightmare before Christmas of Bill Belichick. His last win in the NFL came against the Denver Broncos, but Mike Gesicki is a guy that obviously has floated around. I think he's kind of played a hybrid role, like going back to his time in Miami, like he was a flex option, play in the slot, play on the outside, played in line. And I think he can do a little bit of everything. Now, I think the narrative is that you need a tight end who can come in and block. There aren't many dudes that are really built like, George Kittle, who can block and also attack in the passing game. I think you got to take what you can there. And if you have to just attribute adding a tight end to alleviate a pass rush, then you have a problem at offensive tackle, in my opinion. So we'll see where Denver's at here. Mike Gesicki would be a sleeper pick under the radar. Broncos country, we threw out a lot of names and a lot of options here for the Broncos to maybe look at during NFL free agency. Is this a position you feel like they should go spend money on here when March 13th rolls around? 2:00 p.m. Mountain Time free agency frenzy. Let us know your thoughts. And if we missed a tight end prospect that is going to be a free agent that you felt like we should have talked about, let us know here on the Locked On Broncos podcast. But with that said, Broncos country, we appreciate you so much for tuning in, making us your first listen of the day every single day. For all you everydayers out there, here's what you can expect on tomorrow's episode of the show. Sayre and myself, we're going to sit down. We're going to take a look at offensive line options. If the Broncos do move on from Garrett Bowles, who's a tackle that they can maybe pursue? If the Broncos don't decide to bring back Lloyd Cushenberry, are they going to stay in-house or could they add somebody as well? You'll get that on tomorrow's brand new episode of the show.